So I guess we'll get started, and perhaps in true University of Toronto fashion, people will filter in through the digital space. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the first Labor and Humanities seminar, jointly hosted by the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies here at the University of Toronto. I'm Patrick Scanlon. I'm an assistant professor, cross-appointed to the two centers. And these seminars are intended to explore some of the intersections between the major areas of research of these two hubs of interdisciplinary research at the University of Toronto. So the CIRHR is a center for the study of work, the interdisciplinary study of work with researchers drawn from the social sciences and the humanities, exploring the past and the future of work and the place of work in a changing world. And the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies is an interdisciplinary center focused on the humanities that takes as its primary field of research the story of human migration and the transnational phenomena that accompany with it, that accompany it. And so the Labor and Humanities seminar is intended to explore the intersections between these two very broad fields of work. And in the course of this year, we're inviting a number of distinguished scholars whose work deals with the study of labor very broadly construed. And so this afternoon, we have our first speaker for the year, Professor Diana Kim from Georgetown University. So Professor Kim is an assistant professor at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And she's also a core faculty member in Asian Studies at Georgetown. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. And she is the author of Empires of Vice, The Rise of Opium Prohibition Across Southeast Asia, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. I don't know why I said it in 2020, gave it this kind of, in 2020. So an essential piece of scholarship on the place of opium within the history of economic life, the history of imperialism, the history of transnational commodity flows. And so this afternoon, Professor Kim is here to present some of her new research on the economic life of untouchability, part of a new project on untouchable labor in a wide variety of different contexts. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Kim. We'll spend about half an hour, or she'll spend about half an hour discussing her research, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. But for the moment, please enjoy Diana Kim's presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Am I audible? Thank you, Professor Scanlon, for the very kind introduction and also for the opportunity to share my work with the community here at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources, as well as the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. I'm super eager to share what is a new and part of a larger project on the transnational history and comparative politics of untouchability. Untouchability as a hereditary form of hyper-marginalizing discrimination that often manifests through practices and beliefs of corporal and symbolic contact as polluting and dangerous, is often thought of as a peculiarly Indian problem. By contrast, the book that I'm developing aims to explore a more diverse range of groups across the world and through history that have been called untouchable by their states, societies, as well as in their own words. Untouchability in the 21st century often goes by the name of work and descent-based discrimination in international politics, or quote-unquote caste discrimination. We live in a moment when the map of untouchable groups is becoming ever busier, with parallels being drawn, groups being made newly visible, and solidarity spurring new vocabularies of comparability and ways of transnational analogy. In a landmark study under the United Nations Human Rights Commission in 2001, people in Japan, India, and other parts of South Asia who experienced this kind of discrimination, depicted as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, were brought under a common category of human rights violations. And in a subsequent working paper here, Groups beyond Asia were included, naming the Hamashin in Yemen, the Osu in southeastern Nigeria, the Nino in Senegal, the Roma in Europe, and so on and so forth, along with their diaspora communities across the world. So how can we understand this variety? How do we understand a global and uneven distribution of untouchable groups? And what is the greater visibility and familiarity of some, such as Dalits in India, compared to others less well known, like the baekjeong of Korea that I'll speak of today? What does this unevenness tell us about our own knowledge and biases? So I'm at an early stage of this project, but in a kind of very general and broad sense, there are three lines of argument that I'm interested in developing further. The first is that the comparative politics of untouchability can be productively examined through the lens of stigmatized labor, linked to ways of work and occupations, both essential to and despised by communities. I'll term this the study of the economic life of untouchability. Second, I'd like to put forth that the 20th century history of empires, wars, and decolonization are central to the story of why the visibility of untouchable groups vary today. Some of the Dalits, the burakumin, and the baekjeong that I examine fit within major currents of transnational mobility. The rise and fall of the 19th century quote-unquote coolie trade following the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, the intra-Asian migration flows that were especially peaked during the 1870s to the 1940s from India and Japan into Southeast Asia for labor, from Japan to Manchuria for wartime mobilization forces. And in the case of Korea, in the wake of Japanese colonial rule's end and amidst the Korean War, massive within country refugee movements as the peninsula was divided politically into two, and subsequent overseas migration into South America into the 1960s. I'm keen to explore and stress the mobile nature of groups deemed untouchable, not least because they're often thought of as anchored to their home communities, whether by hereditary status or by poverty. But the archives and the oral histories that I've conducted allude to more fluidity, more movement than we often appreciate. And then third and finally, I'm interested in focusing on the role of state action as it oscillates between positions of recognition and redress for untouchable groups. And I want to think through government policies for anti-discrimination as part of larger projects of nation-making at the margins of the past and ongoing endeavors to define equal but different citizens, and how language with racialized, ethnicized difference play into such dynamics. And so for just today, I'm going to be focusing on the first, this conceptual bit about the economic life of untouchability, with examples drawn from Japan's burakumin and Korea's baekjeong. I'm super happy to speak about the other two during our discussion and during the Q&A. So what is the economic life of untouchability? The notion of untouchability, tightly linked to the Indian caste system, is often familiar as a hereditary hierarchy, with practices of endogamy, avoiding commensality, and complex systems of taboos that at once draw upon and reconfigure boundaries of ritual, religious, social, intimate, institutional stratification. As the social theorist Gopal Guru notes, quote, "There is an excess of meaning embedded in untouchability," unquote. And pollution and impurity are perhaps amongst the most insidious that take expression, both through everyday and spectacular ways of exclusion, humiliation, and exploitation. For many, this dense constellation of excess meaning and its making has resonated beyond India. In spring 1966, at a symposium on caste and race held in Basel, anthropologists, historians, and social scientists came together and discussed the quote-unquote pariah castes compared, addressing similarities and differences amongst the Mahars and other untouchable groups in India and Sri Lanka, the so-called American Negro, the Japanese burakumin, the Jews and the Gypsies in Europe, alongside slaves and ancient Africans. Untouchability has also elicited comparisons across what are called caste-like societies to racial and ethnicized discrimination, perhaps the most well-known and recently popular of which is the American author Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, which brings the United States, India, and Nazi Germany into a common framework. And in these discussions, of course, the economic aspects of untouchability have not gone unnoticed. For Max Weber and Louis Dumont, occupational specializations that consigned some to the most menial of tasks within the caste system had religious and ideological foundations that differentiated from class stratification and inequality. The Indian sociologist Aman Srinivas centered jati-based divisions of labor in his influential work on India's rural subsistence economy and its transitions, while Ambedkar, in his powerful writings, Untouchables were the children of India's ghettos, developed, of course, his famous thesis of graded inequality, quote, an ascending scale of hatred and downward scale of contempt, unquote, which has informed scholars more recently interrogating the relationship between vocation and schismatic principles that divide subcaste groups. Looking to Japan, students of medieval and early modern periods underscore the complex nature, for instance, of the leather industry, with trade networks and supply chains managed by the Eta, the untouchable group of Japan at the time, who in turn have tenuous genealogies linking them to those called the burakumin today. And the history of families, kinship groups, and residency areas that specialize in low status work passed through generations is familiar also in recent work on Korea, Nigeria, Senegal, Yemen, and Somalia. And so, put simply, what a rich and growing interdisciplinary literature tells us is that there's nothing monolithic about the work and labor that untouchable groups have and do perform. So I want to dig deeper into this occupational realm across context and time, because one thing that really strikes me are a set of recurring dualities. That is, while the menial aspects of the stigmatized work are best known, the occupations that untouchable groups specialized in were not and are not necessarily unskilled. And that within occupation stratification leads to poverty and discourses of contempt and disgust, yes. But there's also a sort of odd dignity, diminished skill and craft for even the most injurious forms of work. Wealth and penury are both part of the economic life of untouchability, as are pride and shame, resignation and aspiration. And I'd like to argue that these are the micro-level textures to the lives of people, which are in turn intimately tied to more abstract forms of labor value and large and macroeconomic political interests, but in selective ways that reinforce and reify what we see as defining characteristics of untouchable groups, namely the pollution narratives and the social exclusion practices. So then what does that give us analytically? What is the purchase to viewing untouchability through this lens of necessary but despised labor? To center attention on this duality of stigmatized work as both wanted and found repugnant by others. Let me draw just a few examples from Japan and Korea to suggest two answers. First, it gives us reason to re-examine the historical logics of state-sponsored intervention. In August 1871, the Meiji government officially liberated the untouchable groups. It issued a simply worded decree that, quote, the names Eta, Hinin, and so forth are hereby abolished. Henceforth, in their status and occupation, they shall be treated as commoners, unquote. This document would later become known as the Emancipation Edict. And focusing really on the word status in the document, it's best known as part of a larger set of transformational, somewhat ineffective modernizing reforms by the Meiji, situated in a global context in which liberal ideas of freedom and equality rendered feudal hierarchies, subjugated people, an anathema to Japan's diplomatic and political endeavors to become a civilized nation in the eyes of encroaching Anglo-European powers during the late 19th century. But when we start to pay attention to the other term, occupation, or shokyo, in the 1871 decree, the language of the state also becomes a lens into the economic worlds of the quote-unquote despised people. The Ministry of State's wording in many ways mirrored the language of an untouchable État chief who had petitioned the government less than a year earlier, requesting that his subordinates be permitted to retain their monopolies over occupations such as leatherwork under his rule, this État chief's rule, which were called the impure industries. And the historian Timothy Amos has a brilliant new book on this particular figure. It's called the Kanzaemon, that shows how this chief untouchable controlled the leather production and distribution economy in Eastern Japan, centered in today's Tokyo area. Throughout the Tokugawa era and in 1870, likely anticipated how the Meiji reforms as they were unfolding, especially their industrializing aspects, would undercut the many sub-monopolies over cattle trade, husbandry, tanning that the État had historically controlled, which were also increasingly useful to the centralizing Japanese state. Second, and related to this, the lens of stigmatized labor and its duality, I'd argue, is a productive one for thinking of the cross-cutting tensions and alliances throughout state, society, and touchable groups throughout these periods. So Korea, like Japan, officially liberated the baekjeong in 1894 under what are called the Kabul reforms. Ironically, the baekjeong had never really been unfree. In pre-1894 Joseon society, this group was distinct from the nobi, who were the slaves and indentured laborers, or other people in relationships of formal servitude to higher status people. Thus, the baekjeong were free but despised, and the meaning of the necessity of their work, for whom and why, evolved. The pioneering work of the Korean sociologist Kim Jung-seop has shown how the baekjeong encompassed a variety of subgroups with different names to which occupational specialization was key. The basket weavers were called the yugijang. The butchers and tanners had names such as the tesalgun, the chain, and the tuan. Different types of leather products were produced by the pijang versus the kappachi versus the pigo, while hejang was a name for those whose leather craft was exclusively for making the leather straps that held a shoe to a person's foot. And altogether, these comprised a fragmented realm of work that was also vertically stratified, with differing ties to quote-unquote outside communities, ranging from the highest of elites to the lowest of commoners, who in turn articulated touching taboos, contamination narratives, and practiced exclusion, but selectively, unevenly, and inconsistently. And so these two images, which I've begun to talk with and have before you now, are from the 1910s. And to me, they help illustrate the sharp occupational stratification and locational variation within the same industries. So on the left, the more well-to-do among the baekjeong were slaughtered. This was taken at a butcher's establishment in Gyeongsang, today's Seoul. And there's three men you see dressed in white. Their hair is more or less neatly tucked back, two under their hats. And they're posing directly for the camera, the gaze of which is likely that of a photographer with the Japanese Governor General's office. This is after Korea's formal annexation to Japan, and the colonial authorities were keenly attentive to the management of livestock and employed some baekjeong for Japan-owned abattoirs. They also sought to train some baekjeong in the veterinarian sciences and hired others to kill the rabid dogs during the summer to protect the population. So these three men, killing pigs and cows in the heart of urban Seoul, had multiple lives. They were people who did work disdained by the commoners who still refused to allow them to send their children to the same schools as their own, who refused to allow marriages within their families, but as people also recognized as doing essential work for the meat-consuming sections of Korean society and helping with the maintenance of public hygiene. These men elucidate people and professions that offended the sensibilities of many in colonial society who saw them as too close to or benefiting too much from ties to the colonial state, that were also in professions that were enviable in the wealth that it enabled them to acquire through their skills. The image on the right is of relatively less well-off tanners, and they're residing outside of the city in a rural hamlet. They're also dressed in white. The hair is more disheveled, and I think there's a chicken fleeing in the back. For the figure who's closest to us in the lens, it's unclear whether or not he knew he was being photographed or not, but certainly he's not posing with his face to the camera. And the different records that I've consulted suggest that it was either a foreign ethnographer who took a picture of this house, the baekjeong and his hides, or a privately contracted photographer. It's unclear where the location is specifically, but it might be in the neighborhood of Gokpong in Jeonju City today, which is in the far south of the Korean Peninsula. And it would be located near a waterway that could carry away the blood from the animals that were brought here to be skinned, which means that it would probably be close to a village, which usually needed the water sources. But it was likely enough that it was at the outskirts of the village, so much so that the stench, the presence, the sight of the baekjeong family would not offend people. The self-avowed respectable classes who would recoil from the mere idea, let alone sight of their mere presence. Thinking through the second class in this right-hand side picture, there are groups, tanners, with further variation, and segregated residencies work differently by location. What this map of Korea, Seoul, today's Seoul, then in the 1920s Gyeongsang shows are the 5 major slaughterhouses, which in turn anchored small cottage industries of tanners and leather workers working around them. Again, their proximate presence was both demanded by urban consumers who had limited transportation means to get their needs, but also reviled, a duality linked to the labor that they performed. For one of these sites, a local newspaper reported in 1922 how, quote, every summer, where the butchers work in, this area in front of the Westgate jail gathers a festering pool of curdled blood and waste from the baekjeong's blood. There was also competition amongst those working at these different sites, which were aggravated by the differential tax rates that the colonial state levied on butchers under what were known as the Posa rules of 1896, which were quickly following the 1894 Cabal reforms that had abolished the baekjeong as a discrete category of discriminated people, but only to make them into newly accountable fiscal subjects to the state. Back in Japan, around this similar time, there was an outcast area of what is today's Asakusa in Tokyo. It was once, before the major reforms, a tax-exempt land for the Eta, who performed work in the city, both spurned and sought out, the leather flayers and craftsmen, as well as monkey show performers. The residents of this quote-unquote outcast area saw their customary rights to the land that they built their houses on revoked by the government that offered to sell back the land and collect 3% in direct taxes. Some of the untouchable groups were able to do so and perhaps stayed. Others left, whether in disgust, despair, or hope of a better life elsewhere. Some by volition, others involuntarily. In many respects, that differences in untouchable occupations and within occupations should link to economic inequality is perhaps not that surprising. Yet I think it's worth stressing and digging into what the nature of that labor was, these small differences that comprise the moral economy of untouchable work, because it helps unsettle impressionistic ideas of a homogeneous group as uniformly victimized, trapped by rigid forms of tradition, stubborn prejudice, and structurally induced vulnerability. Certainly, these are true. But throughout history and today, the range of experiences, the sentiments, and the ways of work were and are much wider, much more varied. And I'll conclude just on this point, which is to stress how the economic life of untouchability, in its variety, I hope, can be a productive point of departure to reflect upon, interrogate, and explain hyper-marginalization and dense regimes of discrimination, their reasons for persistence, as well as selective visibility, both past and present. Thank you.
I've reappeared. Well, thank you very much for an introduction to a fascinating project. And I'm going to open the floor to questions. I have some questions of my own, but I'm going to start with a question from the audience from Dion Polar, which is, Dinah, do you think that untouchability comes from the nature of work, or that the nature of work leads to the categorization of people or classes of people as untouchable? Where does this, is it the job or the racialized or class hierarchy that brings us into being?
Sorry, I'm just jotting quickly as I respond. Thank you, Dion. I think that's the core question at stake here for me. Based on the countries that I examine, the simple answer is that the job precedes the racialization of difference and the production of discrete groups that are stigmatized, which I found both striking and surprising, because there's a long tradition of talking of the baekjeong or the burakumin, and indeed Dalits as of foreign races, or as products of ancient forms of migration. They settled within these locales, in Korea and Japan especially, to be slightly mobile people and seen as mobile within an agricultural community as being reason to see them as distinct, are one of the many axes, in addition to race and ethnicity, through which these groups are seen as different. But in terms of the stigma that builds around their being different, especially the rude forms of pollution narratives or aversion to contact, are often ones that come into play later on to render difference into discrimination. And in that regard, it strikes me that job before or work before group analytically makes sense. Yet at the same time, we come to a point where they're all entangled so much that the question almost becomes one of a chicken versus egg question. And how to kind of approach this is something that I'm still struggling with. And I'd love to hear your reaction or any suggestions you might have.
While some of the people in the audience mull over that question, there's another question from Catherine Evans, which is, I'm struck by the Tanner's communities on the 1922 map, one of the maps that you showed on your slides. How did discourses of pollution intersect, if at all, with fears of contagion? Were there any shifts over time, perhaps in response to changes in understandings of disease transmission and or epidemics? Which I guess is a question with some resonances in the present as well.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. So there are two ways to get at the question, and I'm speaking as I'm thinking through it. One is before 1910, when the annexation of Korea to Japan is more or less finalized, at which point a lot of these slaughterhouses are still linked to the royal household. And so they're seen as both kind of protected spaces, but also ones that constantly put the urban population at risk because of, I mean, blood is such a central story here, and I found that really surprising. The idea that the blood will not be properly disposed of, that it curdles on the street, that it becomes a cesspool for diseases onwards is always a fear, but it's more of a muted form, and it comes with like a larger set of discourses about the value of the animals too. What happens after 1910 is, there are historians who've written beautifully about this, the extent to which hygiene was kind of central to visions of modernity that the Japanese brought in, and the ways in which it overlapped with the value of livestock for export to Japan. So Korea was the major exporter for cattle into Japan, made the health of the animals an enormous political concern, along with the ways in which they might pollute or infect the environment of the city. And urbanization was also taking a kind of new invigorated turn in the 1910s onward, which together means absolutely, yes. Fears about the spread of diseases was very central to the kind of stigma and need for kind of cordon sanitaires being reinforced around these areas. And at the same time, as the kind of public health and hygiene related knowledge of the Japanese authorities shift, they're very influenced by Germany at this time, they change their own diagnoses of how much responsibility these polluted areas, the kind of livestock herding areas, how much the slaughterhouses are actually responsible for the diseases. So in a lot of ways, thinking through the slaughterhouse areas, their residents, as well as the little different communities that are surrounding them, is a really interesting lens to get at what are the shifting discourses, both of the colonial power, as well as what are the inheritances from the previous pre-colonial Korea butting heads within here. I feel very like 21st century to be able to both read the chat thanks and also speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll also, I mean, this talk is also, and I think perhaps we'll also keep a recording in terms of the question and answer as well, if we can, just for people who might, in this age of synchronous and asynchronous education, hopefully, you know, there'll be some asynchronous education available. But there's another question from the chat from Sanjna Lal, which is, I really enjoyed this talk, both because it's a fascinating project in and of itself, and also because I'm coming from a space where I've been researching urban Dalit women's access to justice. As such, I was wondering whether and how the forces of urbanization change the nature of work for the groups you looked at. And parenthetically, I may have missed this, but I would love to hear more if it's something that you can share.
Sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
It's just that, parenthetically, I may have missed this, but I would love to hear more. So whether or not, what the relationship of urbanization is to this, to the nature of untouchable work.
Right, totally central. And I would actually love to be in touch to hear more about your work on the urban Dalits women and their approaches to justice, because it's an area that I'm keen to learn more about. From both the Korea and Japan side, and there's a slight difference in this, the ways in which urbanization is both linked to different types of industries being hosted within the city is a really big part of the story of the untouchable labor and the discourses around it. So in the case of Seoul, many of the slaughterhouses were initially connected to ranches, which were outside of the city walls. And I think the common misconception is that the baekjeong were always polluted, they were always kind of disreputable, so they always had to be on the outskirts. And this kind of gets back to Diane's point. But it's actually not so much the case based on the records that I've seen. They're situated outside because it's better land, it's better pasture, it's a better place to have cattle. But with urbanization, there's an increased demand for meat consumption within the cities themselves. There's also kind of democratization of tastes. But transportation is a bit slower to pick up. So to be able to move the kind of livestock killed, packaged into the city, there's a delay enough that it inconveniences urban consumers. And it also is, there's also the kind of health considerations also come into play. So what happens is a lot of the slaughterhouses are built within the city afterwards. So urbanization goes hand in hand with the new hosting of these pockets within the city. They're geographically shaped by where the major, the river, the Han River is, and the different streams. Because whatever happens, you kind of need a water source in order to take out the waste that comes from these places. So in that sense, both the spatial geography of the city in many ways both shapes and it's kind of reshaped by the placement of these industries. But it's also part of a larger growing of the capital city itself. That's one story about the capital, and Tokyo has kind of a similar story. There's a whole different set of ways in which the penetration of different industries, as well as the movement of workers into the city, happened for non-capital cities. So Jinju in the south is a city where I was doing a bit of oral histories, and I visited quite often. There, it's a different story about rural migration, the movement of people into the cities. And here is where the story becomes speculative. A lot of the stories that I heard were that with modernizing reforms, people were no longer able to, or they lost control over the very small plots of land that they held as these baekjeong groups. And so they were dislocated and they moved into cities to become rickshaw pullers or to do kind of casual menial labor. And that both reinforced perceptions of the baekjeong as more lower class, ghettoized, associated with crime, which is the bias today. I think that's right, but I haven't been able to see many records that kind of support that story. And this opens up a whole set of questions about what exactly are the archives and sources through which to do this type of history. The people themselves don't leave a lot of records. There are weird registration practices that make these individuals legible in weird ways in government records. So for instance, after 1871, and this happens in 1894 in Korea as well, a lot of the ETA and the baekjeong were not formally part of government, of official registries. So, and the family registry in the case of Japan was introduced after the Meiji reforms. So when they put them in, they started to newly register these groups afterwards, but they also called them new commoners, which became a euphemism for, okay, you guys were not the commoners in the past, so people were able to trace them. So in the case of Japan, these records are locked by law, so you can't technically find them. And then in terms of doing oral histories, I can find no family in Korea that would be happy to proclaim that they were once, they're the descendants of the baekjeong class, because there's not stigma associated with it, but it's not a point of pride. And so the ways in which I've gotten to figuring out who was moving and how people were moving has to do with a lot of oral histories, a lot of stories listened to, as well as kind of sleuthing around through odd papers. Sorry, that was a really roundabout answer.
I'm going to assume my prerogative here. I have two questions, and one is a kind of broader methodological question that I think will help. You know, I hope if you're attending this seminar, you'll attend the others, and if you're watching this online, that you'll come and see the others as well. Because one of the kind of uniting themes, I think, of many of the historians and other scholars who are taking part in this seminar, especially this year, is this idea of economic life, right? That's a concept that I use as well. And I was just wondering, as a first question, I'll pose the other one is more specific to your research. If you could think aloud about what that lens of economic life is, and what it gives the study of labor that, say, a more kind of traditional political economy approach, or a more traditional approach associated with political science might bring. So what is economic life doing here for you?
And you're going to save the second question for after my answer. Okay. No, it's a great question, and it's one that I'm happy to think aloud about, but I would also really love your reactions as well as those of the audience, because I think it's a super important point. For me, in a nutshell, thinking through the economic life is very much about the micro scale. It's about the individuals as the primary unit of analysis for me, meaning that the focus is of discourse, of perception, of profits. Wages is another thing that I try to get into in another chapter. For me, the individual level matters, and that's what I find a productive lens. Thinking in conversation with my home discipline of political science, as well as certain types of political economic research, I think the difference is that once you take seriously the individual, the average for a group often doesn't make sense. It's hard to figure out either the preferences. Group preferences look much more complicated. Rather than a normal kind of distribution, it might make sense to think more about polarized distributions even within a single group, just because the more we know about individuals, the more we know about how incomplete the records through which we understand who comprises a group in the first place is, and then our very definition of the collective and where the individual fits in becomes more complicated. As a methodological kind of point, just thinking about how do you then do a history or a research on economic life, my personal feeling has been, and this also comes from my previous work on opium, which dealt a lot with the opium tax farms across Southeast Asia and their centralization, effective nationalization by the governments, is that there's certain types of behavior, and it often relates to work and labor, that are better told through stories and through narratives, because they're complex processes, and narratives are good ways to expose those complexities. I don't think that's universally true. I don't, like, in a lot of ways, I don't think an economic life lens is appropriate for all types of research, and I think political economists do very well in terms of thinking about international trade relations, in terms of thinking about corporate and labor kind of relations. But I think there are certain types of issues that are better thought through this hyper micro, hyper individualized approach to narrative.
Yeah, in the chat, Dion Puller comments that something central to the concept of economic life seems to require considering the meaning of work to individuals within these groups, right? So it is I really like that definition, right? It helps to think about the ways that methods of scholarship associated with the humanities, like archival research, the thick description, can be brought to bear on questions that are traditionally thought of as being questions that can be only answered with numerical data, right? That it's a way of kind of figuring out or placing into conversation quantitative data with the way that human beings actually experience the world, right? As economic actors with a kind of internal narrative, rather than as just sort of units of economic production. But I had a broader question. So this story is taking place, and the examples that you used in your talk today are examples connected to the kind of meat trade, right? Which coincidentally is one of the core points of origin for the labor movement, right, in North America, slaughterhouses, and it's also a point of origin for industrial production, right? Henry Ford is inspired by pig carcasses sliding along on hooks when he builds the Model T. And I was just wondering, what role do untouchable slaughterhouse workers play in that global story? Is this are they processing animals for export, or is this all for domestic consumption? And how does that change their everyday lives?
That's a great question. So one, because I tend to think more productively when I'm a bit more concrete, there are two really interesting connections to the US that I've seen for Korea and Japan. One is that the design of the slaughterhouses in Seoul draw almost explicitly from Chicago. There are a few guys who travel to Chicago. They're like, whoa, this is super cool. They have a really good industrialized slaughterhouse in the meatpacking kind of district. So the designs are almost exactly those. And there's like a fascinating local history written by a local story. It's not a story, it's a bit of a chronicle written by a historian with one of the municipal museums in Seoul. So there's that connection. And then later in the 20th century for Japan, and the anthropologist Joseph Hankins has demonstrated this in his work on working skin, there's a connection between the tanners in Japan to ranches in Texas. So a lot of the Texas ranch livestock are brought in, the kind of production of hides happens within there. And so it's one of the big, like huge trade connections between Korea, Japan, and the United States. For the time period that I look at specifically, I can't see much in terms of direct connections, in terms of the flows across the Pacific. And in a lot of ways, I don't find that terribly surprising. It strikes me as a rather inefficient way to go about dealing with both, whether it's the provision of livestock or whether it's the kind of packaging or the product production. The transnational connections that I do see in work are Korea to Japan, and as I briefly mentioned, Korea's livestock is shipped often to Japan, and then the connection to Manchuria, especially in the 30s, both for wartime mobilization related kind of gear, as well as I think there's some movement of cattle. I haven't been able to really trace that down, but those are for like industrial purposes. Within city slaughterhouses are, I think they're mostly for within city consumption, because those are the stories that I'm seeing most often. It's about someone's house had this festival and they really need this meat and it's supplied by this particular group next to this particular slaughterhouse. During the major kind of ceremonies, a lot of the Confucian influenced ceremonies, having a pig's head and being able to kind of bow before the pig's head has huge ritual value for ancestral piety and so forth. So there's actually a pretty constant demand for those too. So I think it's very much at the sumptuary kind of local consumption level.
That's a really interesting point. I think it segues nicely into a question from Catherine Evans in the chat, which is, I'm just thinking about sort of the symbolic and religious value of certain kinds of cuts of meat and the way that untouchable laborers supply that. So Catherine asks, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about how these occupational groupings are explained or justified specifically in Korea. So is untouchability sacralized, or is it about tradition, or is it maintained only through stigma and marginalization, or are there other internal community pressures or incentives at work? What kinds of forces work in order to keep people untouchable and to keep people in untouchable occupations?
That's a great question. So, right, the justifying narratives happen. I think there are at least three ways to kind of slice it. The stories that the middle class, and I'm using averages here, that the middle class people will tell about the rural untouchables, the stories that the middle class will tell about the urban untouchables, and then the stories that a lot of these, at least the meat industry involved ones, tell about themselves, which I think is also a pretty important kind of justifying narrative, because it does a lot of work for boundary policing. I mean, it would be a mistake to think that ostracization, segregated communities, and like endogamous marriages are happening only because non-untouchable people don't want it. There's an equally strong push within to defend or to kind of anticipate stigma will happen and thus fend against it. So you see justifications in terms of invoking ancient myths and traditions. And this is from the level of the Untouchables kind of self-narrative that, so the cow is kind of central, both because it's agriculturally incredibly important. It's a major kind of source of work as well. And so the idea that the baekjeong are actual guardians of the cows in this life, and then in the next life, they'll be rewarded for the care and the kind of humane way in which that they cared for the cows and the ways in which they humanely slaughtered them. So that's one type of narrative. And it gets picked up a lot by intellectuals at the time who use the anti-baekjeong discrimination as a kind of metaphor for the intolerance of colonial society. So it works as a trope within there as well. The negative kind of stereotyping that comes in, the justifying of having this group, I mean, it happens in a functional way, which is kind of shockingly explicit. It's to say that, yeah, we're a nice modernizing society, but even a modernizing society always needs someone to do the dirty work. This is the bad work. The Untouchables have always done it. They should know their place. And that's one type of narrative that comes through. Another one is kind of a more conflicted one to say that, yeah, it would be a great world where everyone is equal and we embrace our untouchable kind of brethren. But I really like within educational realms, and so they segment realms in education and in intimacy, it's unthinkable. But within other spaces, it's tolerated. And one place where that happens a lot is within churches. So there were huge disputes in the 1890s onward about whether or not the Korean untouchable could sit within the same churches, whether you would have segregated aisles or if some should sit outside versus some should sit inside. And this is at a time when a lot of the kind of Baptist missionaries are doing a lot of work. They're the ones with the kind of leading a lot of the church services. And so there the argument is that we're Christians, we don't discriminate, we want everyone to sit together, and there's huge backlash against it. So they're cross-cutting, and there are a lot of different justifications that happen. I can't give a really good answer to your great question about the big forces, but let me try to do it indirectly by just explaining how Korea's experiences, those, one reason why I find it interesting. It's the only place that I have found where the discrimination and overt stigma against untouchable groups disappears after the mid-20th century. It's a story that can be told on the one hand as the triumph of human rights, which is the nationalist story that Korean kind of scholars often tell. It's that there was a really active anti-colonial movement that also took up this cause of social equality. It triumphed. It erased kind of discrimination from people's hearts, and thus we no longer have untouchables. So much so that no one remembers them today. And today in Korea, people are very happy kind of using the term baekjeong. It's not a nice term, but it's a term that you'll see romanticized. It's attached to some restaurants to just refer to the meat aspects. So that's one story that's told. I think there's a more complicated story, and it's the one that I'm interested in pursuing in a different chapter of this project, which is that there's something about the end of colonial rule, World War II, and Korea's experience with the Korean War, which happened in quick succession within 4 years. There's a massive population reshuffling, destruction of records of people's land records, as well as family registries. And then during the American occupation of Korea, there's an opportunity given for people to rename themselves. And the idea there was that people can give up their Japanese era names, which were imposed by the colonial authorities. But what in fact I see happening is that people also use this as an opportunity to reinvent their identities. And there are very few people who would deliberately seek to reinvent themselves as the most discriminated class from the colonial and pre-colonial period. So I think there's a really interesting confluence of events, traumatic, war, decolonization, as well as new nation building, during which, with the kind of division of Korea into North and South and communism, the baekjeong cause is often associated with hyper equality, more within communism. And so it also becomes a topic that is unspeakable within South Korea's political discussions after the 1950s. I think that's a story which lends to not a triumph of human rights, but assimilation, integration, or perfect invisibility. And I'm not quite sure which one it is, and that's something that I'm kind of thinking through a lot.
I think, I mean, I'll keep an eye on the chat, but I have one more question, and then we'll see as we sort of come towards the end of the seminar. And this is a more general question about the project as a whole. I'm curious, I think it's clear here in the story that you just told us about naming and occupations and Japanese colonialism, right? That untouchability is strongly associated, or at least the survival of untouchability is strongly associated with colonial rule, right? And the way that, and it is, untouchable occupations are useful to colonial governments because they secure a supply of labor in the kinds of occupations that you described today are all kind of essential jobs for the functioning of a society, but that are jobs that are either difficult or considered unclean, polluted, but someone needs to do them, right? And one of the, so I was curious if you could take a kind of wider angle lens here and think about, maybe think aloud about the relationship between colonialism and untouchable labor. I think we see it clearly in Korea in your presentation today, but if you could give us a sense of where your project is taking that question in other locations or in a general sense.
No, it's a great question. One thing that I grappled a lot with was about putting India, Japan, and Korea within a common framework to think about untouchability. If we think in narrow terms of colonialism as conquest, territorial conquest, and loss of sovereignty and governance, and all of those exploitation, Korea and India could look quite similar, but Japan arguably was a colonizing power. And so there's something different going on there. So what I'm thinking through is that maybe it's not about colonialism in the sense of being the colonized power, or maybe it's not colonialism in the sense of being colonized renders certain types of labor within that conquered territory more instrumental and useful for the colonizing power, but it's something larger about the ways in which an empire and being within a world divided amongst empires matters for the utility of this type of labor. And within that framework, I think it makes more sense. All of these three sites, and I'm hoping to expand into the African context someday, maybe decades from now. But it's that the context that I look at, the British Empire and its multi-site coverage, the Japanese Empire's kind of multi-site coverage from the home islands to Manchuria into Southeast Asia, renders it a place where the value of labor and labor that can also be transferred across different colonies. So this happens a lot during the build up to World War II and during World War II. To have labor that is useful, that can also be mobilized into fighting. So a lot of the Japanese burakumin serve within the military, and there's overt discrimination within, but they're also ostensibly equal fighting soldiers, and their pensions are also similar ones. So I would try to think about empire, and then of course it begs the question of what is empire and what unit and at what scale are we talking about? And for now, my resort would be to go back to the question that you and Diana, I think it posed very well about economic life. If empires operate on multiple scales, then there are certain levels that are more salient to the individual. And I think those shift over time. The kind of transnational movement of labor for burakumin, sometimes they matter enormously, especially during the Russo-Japanese War. So in that sense, empire matters a great deal. At other moments, it's really about whether or not one of the industries that they're in is going to get a contract from the local city. And then it becomes a hyper micro scale. But I think if that would be one way that I would get at the colonialism question.
I think that's a great answer, and maybe a good place to wind up our discussion. The way that economic life helps us to understand, what levels of political economy, what levels of imperial rule, redound on the lives of individuals. So, on behalf of my colleagues in the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and in the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, I really want to thank Professor Diana Kim of the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University for her talk this afternoon. If you enjoyed this, there will be two other seminars later on in the term, one in February. Professor Sarmaila from the University of Virginia is coming to talk about thalidomide and whistleblowing. And then Professor Ashish Siddique from the University of Massachusetts Amherst is coming to talk about 18th century record keeping and administration in the British Empire. So, sorry, go ahead, Diana.
If I can, right before you wrap up, if I can just say how grateful I am to the audience, and also just to very genuinely say, if you have any thoughts or reactions or just sources or literature that you think would be helpful or relevant, I'd really appreciate emails. I'm at that happy stage where everything is interesting to me, and I'm trying to figure out a lot of the questions that came up during the talk. So I will be very grateful for your feedback, and I will try to reciprocate in turn. So, and thank you, Patrick, sorry.
No problem. Thank you very much. And to everybody in the audience, I know there are a lot of screens demanding your time these days. So I appreciate your attention, and I hope that we'll get a chance to see you again later on in the term. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Diana.
Thanks.